All right, good afternoon or good evening. Welcome. Thank you for coming on a rainy Wednesday at the end of the semester. It's totally going to be worth your while. So, on behalf of the Rappaport Center and my co-director, Karen Engel, I would like to welcome you to this presentation by Professor Sinan Antoon, who is an associate professor at the Gallatin School of Individualized Studies at NYU. But that's probably the least interesting thing about him. He's a prominent Iraqi novelist, poet, critic, translator, and filmmaker. He's the author of several volumes of poetry in Arabic, 2 in Arabic, 1 in English, 4 novels, and a about to be published novel that will be published in Beirut like tomorrow. Okay, or soon. And do you have is that one going to be translated into English? Or okay. Hopefully translated into English. His work has been translated into many, many languages. And it's actually a privilege to welcome him to the University of Texas. And it's, you know, in a way I could say I wish there were more people here, but it's also an honor and a privilege to be in a more intimate setting. And hopefully we're going to have a lively conversation. Professor Antoon is going to read to us from his most recent novel, and then we're going to have a chat. All right, so please join me in welcoming Sinan Antoon.
Thank you so much, Neville, for the introduction, and thank you, Karen, both of you, for the invitation. I'm honored and delighted to be here. Thank you, Caroline, for all the help in making this happen. And thank you all for coming at such a tough time in the semester. So I'm going, as Neville said, I'm going to read excerpts from a novel that I've been working on for the last 5 or 6 years, which is coming out tomorrow in Beirut. And I have already translated the excerpts and will come out in English, hopefully. And we'll say just a few things about the context of the novel and its events and why I wrote it. So, one of the major aspects of Iraqi society and politics at home and in the diaspora is the struggle in narratives and claims of victimhood, as happens in so many societies that suffer from war and dictatorship. In hindsight, the 1980s seem relatively simple and straightforward in comparison to the present. I'm talking about the 1980s because there was a long war between Iraq and Iran from 1980 to 1988. Back then, there was one major villain, the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein. Its crimes were more or less well known to most Iraqis, if not to the world at large. There was, of course, an official state narrative and history that was countered by exiled opposition figures and parties. The series of disastrous wars since the invasion of Kuwait, in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait, and that was followed by the so-called Desert Shield operation started by the United States, which was then turned into Desert Storm, which then was followed by the 1991 Gulf War, whose primary objective was to eject the Iraqi army of Kuwait, which was understandable, but it also involved the destruction of the infrastructure of Iraq. And I hate to say it, but since he was a Texan, in the words of James Baker, then Secretary of State, he said, "We will bomb them back to the pre-industrial age." That was followed by what is now considered a series of genocidal sanctions from 1990 to 2003, according to Joy Gordon, American scholar. Those sanctions amounted to genocide. And then in 2003, when the sanctions were lifted, we had the Anglo-American military invasion and occupation, whose anniversary just passed a few weeks ago, and the dismantling of the Iraqi state and its institutions, and putting in its place ethno-sectarian political system by the US, which led to massive violence, the rise of militias and sectarian tensions, which led to major demographic changes in Baghdad and other parts of the country. No Iraqi's life has not been touched by these catastrophic events. And the characters of my novels are all, in a way, their lives and their trajectories are, of course, directly and indirectly affected by all of this. Both the country and its history are now crowded with villains and victims from all backgrounds, some of whom have switched positions on the hierarchies of violence and suffering. Some of the victims of dictatorship have become now figures in the new regime and have become victimizers. There is a cacophony of claims and counterclaims, and there are echoes of all of this in the Iraqi diaspora, where 5.5 million Iraqis live and watch from afar as fellow Iraqis live with the ongoing effects of wars, both dictatorial and imperial. Not unlike its four older siblings, my fifth novel, from which I'll be reading today, is concerned with the damaged bodies and psyches of subjects who lived through the violence of dictatorship and wars. Rather than Iraq, however, like the first four novels, its events unfold mostly in the diaspora. In Dearborn, Michigan, in a goat farm in New Jersey, and in Brooklyn. The narrative alternates between two main characters. Both are Iraqi refugees, but from different generations, different class backgrounds, and different political orientations. Omar is a young man who deserted the military in Iraq in the late 1990s and was arrested and punished, leaving him physically and psychologically scarred. After his release, he works in construction to make enough money to escape to neighboring Jordan, and there applies for asylum to come to the US. When he arrives in the US, he is placed in Detroit, Michigan, home to the largest Iraqi-American community in North America, but he is hell-bent on erasing the past and severing any and all bonds to his background and home country. The other character, Sami, who was in his late 60s, was a very successful surgeon in Baghdad with his own private practice. Following the outbreak of the violence after the US invasion, he is terrorized by a militia that took over his neighborhood for belonging to the other sect and allegedly being loyal to the previous regime. He is forced to leave Baghdad because his wife and his brother are assassinated, and after a brief stay in Dubai with a relative, he comes to Brooklyn to live with his son, who had settled 15 years earlier. Sami cannot acclimate to his new home, and he longs for and clings to a space that survives intact only in his memory. So these are the two main characters who have conflicting relationships to Iraq and what Iraq means. I'll read a section of Sami. When he woke up from the nap he was taking on the comfortable, oversized leather recliner, an old black and white Egyptian film was playing on the large TV screen. He didn't try to identify the actors or remember the film's title because he was surprised to find himself in this strange place. He tried to sit up. He had pushed the backrest all the way back to raise his feet, but he couldn't lower the footrest. He forgot that he could easily do that using the release handle on the lower right side. He moved his feet off the footrest and onto the hardwood floor, leaned with his arms on both armrests, and got up. It's funny, you could look better without your glasses. See better. The remote control fell from his lap and landed on the floor. The wall to his left was covered with bookshelves. All the titles were in English. The hands of the square-shaped clock on the wall above the TV screen were at 3:15. To the left of the TV, there was a huge fireplace, whose firebox was sealed with bricks. Elegantly framed photographs sat on its white mantle. He took a few steps to the fireplace and scrutinized them. A handsome man with black hair stood next to an attractive brunette. The two appeared separately and together in some of the other photographs, at times with two little children. He was startled when he recognized himself standing with all four in one of the photographs. He couldn't recognize anyone. How did they put him there? He couldn't understand. It's not a nightmare. One cannot wake up to one. He heard the sound of a car driving by outside. He looked to his left. Two bay windows with their white curtains drawn allowed the afternoon sun to come through. A large silver plate on a rectangular coffee table nearby reflected the rays. He averted his eyes and saw a hallway and part of the staircase leading to the second floor. He took a few steps and turning left, he saw a kitchen. The entrance was to the right. He will get out and go home. He walked to the door. A wooden shoe rack sat on the right next to an umbrella stand. He looked at his feet and saw that he had black socks on. He went back to the living room and found a pair of tan walking shoes next to the recliner. He put them on. They fit. He headed back to the door, opened it, and stepped out. It wasn't cold, and he was wearing a wool sweater. He noticed a black mailbox with his last name printed on it, but it was followed by a slash and another name. He hesitated for a second, but went down the front steps to the sidewalk. There were cars parked on both sides, except for a small stretch in front of the house where a fire hydrant stood. He looked to the right and could see an intersection. He started walking toward it and trying to concentrate and figure out how he ended up here. He just wants to go home. The honey locust and Japanese pagodas had already let go of their leaves, let them fall on the sidewalk. He stepped on some of them as he made his way to the intersection. Before reaching it, he saw an old woman with short white hair wearing jeans and a gray coat. She had a tiny plastic bag in her left hand, while her right hand held her dog's leash. "Afwan, mumkin tsaadini?" he asked her. She looked surprised and answered, "Sorry, I don't understand what you're saying." Why did she answer in English? He could have repeated the question in English, but he didn't, and it was too late. She had already walked past him and was trying to catch up with her Manchester Terrier. He walked on and wondered how could a nightmare be so vivid. The houses he was passing by all looked the same. Brown, reddish exterior, huge bay windows and front steps. Noticed a street sign in English too, indicating times when parking is not allowed. Other signs had a broom with days and times as well. When he got to the intersection, he looked up and read the names of the streets written in white letters on two green signs clasped up high: St. Mark's Avenue, Fifth Avenue. He stood there puzzled. Two teenagers were about to cross, so he approached them. "Excuse me, can I ask you a question?" "Yeah, sure," the shorter one said. "Where are we?" The taller one laughed, saying, "We're on Mars, dog." His buddy reprimanded him with his elbow and told him to shut up, and then addressed the old man respectfully. "This is Park Slope, sir. You need help getting somewhere?" Park Slope. He'd never heard of such a place. "No, thank you." Perhaps he shouldn't ask anyone. He should just walk. Walking always helps him rearrange his thoughts, and it will help him. If this is a nightmare, then he will walk till it ends. Everything his senses were processing was alien. Sights, sounds, smells, faces, and shapes. It exhausted him. The sun was still out, but he felt a dense fog creeping into his head. He looked down at the ground instead. After minutes of looking at his shoes as they hit the sidewalk, he heard a car come to a screeching stop. When he looked up, it was only a few feet away. The driver was furious. His hands registered that by staying on the horn. He apologized, lowering his head and putting his palm on his chest, and rushed to the other side. Minutes later, he thought he heard Arabic, but it was a strange dialect he couldn't identify. His heart leapt. Is this where the nightmare ends? He looked up and saw a stout, bearded young man with short black hair speaking on a mobile phone pressed onto his left ear. He was holding a cigarette in his right hand. "Nahi, nahi," he heard him say. "Mashthish dalhin." He couldn't make out the words. He stood in front of a store. The big sign above read Yemen Market. Ahlan wa sahlan was written on another sign on the glass front, and welcome in English right under it. The young man noticed the old man staring at him while he tried to finish his phone call. "Okay, gotta go, I'll call you later." As soon as he hung up, the old man greeted him in Arabic. "Assalamu alaikum." "Alaikum assalam. Could you please help me?" "Yes, sure. I want to go to Baghdad." The young man laughed. "Baghdad? Baghdad is far away, man. We are in Brooklyn. You'd have to get on a plane and fly there." Flicked his cigarette away with his index finger. "Where do you live?" The old man mumbled. "Huh? Baghdad? No, I mean here in Brooklyn." "Brooklyn? No, He smiled and looked into the old man's hazel eyes. "You look like you're lost." He pointed to the bench outside the store and asked him to have a seat. Please, God willing, we'll help you go home. Extended his hand and said, my name is Abdurrahman. I'm from Yemen. What is your name? He felt the young man's firm grip as he shook his hand. Sami, he said. Ahlan wa sahlan. Can I offer you something? Are you thirsty? No, thanks. You must have something. Coffee? No. Some water at least. Before he could say no again, Abdurrahman motioned to him to sit down and went inside. He returned 20 seconds later with a cold bottle of Poland spring water. Springs, I think. Major flaw. He opened the cap and gave it to him. Sami thanked him and took a good sip. He wiped a few drops off his chin. Looks like you're new here. When did you come from Iraq? Sami said softly, I don't know. Okay, do you know the address? Is there a number we can call? He looked in his pockets. He didn't have anything, not even a wallet or keys. Have you been walking for a while? Which way did you come from? Do you remember the street name? Sami shook his head without saying anything. All these questions irritated him. The Yemenite put his right palm on his beard and started combing it and thinking. A voice called him from inside, so he went back to the store. His brother was behind the counter, asked him why his break took so long and why he'd stopped restocking. This Iraqi man is lost and I'm trying to help him. His brother yelled at him, we have work to do, call the police. That last word scared Sami. He got up and started walking, but at a much faster pace. He heard the Yemenite calling him, sir, wait up. He walked even faster and took the first left. He will keep walking. The nightmare's turns were getting more complicated and bizarre. Everything morphed into colorful fog he walked through. Only the ground beneath was somehow unaffected by the fog. It held on to a spectrum of various shades of gray. He was quite tired, but still did not wake up from the nightmare. He walked and walked. He saw a green bench and sat down. Now we turn to another voice, that of the son. A little after 9 in the evening, a police car stopped in front of our place. I had been waiting on the front steps since I got the call that they had found him. It was dark, but I could see his face in the back seat of the police car. Did he wave to me? I'm not sure now, but I remember that I waved and went down the front steps toward the car. A tall policeman had gotten out of the driver's seat and opened the door. I hugged Baba and kissed him on both cheeks. Where were you, Baba? You were so worried. Why don't you take your cell phone with you? I was walking and felt dizzy, he said as he kissed the kids, who were happy that their Jiddu was back. The policeman asked me, is this your father, sir? Yes. He said that the park police found him sitting on a bench. He fit the missing person description they had sent out earlier. He couldn't provide an address or a contact. I looked at Baba. He shook his head and said in a soft voice in Arabic, Mu sahih, not true. The policeman added, he doesn't have any ID on him. Could you please show me a picture ID proving his identity? Does he reside with you? Yes, of course. When I returned, I handed the passport to the officer who scrutinized it under a flashlight he took out from the holder in his belt. He looked at Baba and said, that's him all right. I see the resemblance. He handed the card back saying, okay, Mr. Al-Badri, you stay safe now and have a good night. He asked me if he could have a word in private. He waited until Heather and Baba had gone up the front steps and too far to hear him. Does your father suffer from cognitive impairment? No, not at all. Well, you might want to have him checked out. He looked very confused when I picked him up. I didn't say anything and thanked him for his help. You bet, he said. When I went inside, they were all sitting in the living room. The twins were not convinced of the official narrative about Baba's temporary disappearance, that he felt dizzy and had to rest. Someone asked him, Jiddu, were you trying to run away? Aren't you happy here? Baba laughed. It was way past their bedtime, and Heather told them that Jiddu was tired and needed to rest, and they should kiss both of us goodnight and go upstairs to their room. Although she too was relieved that he was safe, I could see that she was still upset that the kids had to stay outside because he wasn't there to let them in as usual. The neighborhood is safe, but nevertheless, Our neighbor called her to let her know that she'd asked them to come in when she saw them outside. She phoned me right away, and I left work early. I called the police and came home immediately and started looking in neighboring streets to no avail. When she went up to put the kids to bed, Baba got up from the couch and sat in the recliner and turned on the TV, going through the bundle of Arabic channels we got especially for him. I asked him again what happened, and he stuck to the same answer. Like I told you, I felt dizzy and sat on a bench. But why didn't you take your mobile and keys with you? I forgot. This was not the first incident, but it was the most serious. I thought of what the police officer had said. After an awkward silence, Baba dozed off. He had left the kids waiting outside for half an hour once before. They refused to open the door. Later, he told them it was a joke. But now I'm wondering if he didn't recognize them. He almost started a fire in the backyard when he tried to fire up the grill to make tikka, but instead of beef, he used magazines. He had called me by my dead uncle's name several times. He tried to use his mobile phone as a remote control, which I thought was creative. I looked at him as he slept. Sami al-Badri, the brilliant surgeon with photographic memory, who topped his class in med school in Iraq and was sent in the late 60s on an Iraqi government scholarship to the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, the head of Ibn Nafis Hospital, who conducted hundreds of surgeries. Until now, I'd attributed his odd behavior and lapses to the trauma of what had happened to him in Baghdad, but I'm not so sure now. Once, when we were both watching the news late at night, he told me all of a sudden, I want to go home. I was taken aback. This is your home, Baba, I said. No, I want to go home to my house in Baghdad. I didn't know what to say. That house was long gone. The militia had taken it years ago. He had said this sentence once before when we went to Tannourine, our favorite restaurant in Bay Ridge, to celebrate his birthday. By the way, if you ever go to Brooklyn, go to Tannourine. While we were waiting for the kanafa he loved so much, he went to the restroom and stayed there for more than 20 minutes. I was worried and I went to check on him. He said he couldn't open the door, and when he finally managed to do so, he had a blank look on his face. We walked back to the table, but he headed to the door instead. I followed him and asked him where he was going, and he said, I want to go home. But Baba, don't you want to have the kanafa? He stood there. Oh, yes. Now, after this incident, Sami's situation deteriorates rapidly. He is diagnosed with Lewy body dementia, which displays some of these symptoms. His son hires a home giver, but the situation ends up being unsustainable and dangerous. The family decides reluctantly to move him to an expensive nursing home in Brooklyn where he would be safer. The next excerpt I will be reading gives you a glimpse of the third voice, his caretaker, the nurse Carmen, who is assigned to care for Sami after he's admitted to the nursing home. He wasn't one of my patients originally, but I knew him. I had cared for him briefly for a few days when Marcia was on vacation. A few months later, he was added to my roster when she moved to another state. The supervisor asked me to take him on. She thought we'd be a good fit. She told me I had more patience and energy than anyone else. It wasn't just my patience or energy. There were all those years I spent caring for my grandfather, who suffered from dementia in his last years. I have never told any of my coworkers about Abuelo and his story. I did mention him to the supervisor during the job interview when she asked me about the paragraph in my cover letter. I'd mentioned the effect that experience had had on my career choice and how I approach my work. Sami reminded me of Abuelo, his dark skin, gray mustache, and that deep sorrow in his hazel eyes. His story, too, reminded me of Abuelo, who suffered the ravages of war and had to fight in Vietnam. Although many years had passed since the war's end and his return home, but Vietnam still returned to him quite often, or vice versa. Its flames, blood, and corpses were all often alive when he shut his eyes. He would scream while asleep in his bedroom or on the couch in the living room in our apartment. And I would get very scared, of course. He was probably fighting the ghosts of those he had to kill or trying to protect a fellow soldier. Running through landmines and hiding in his sleep. He would cry like a baby at times. I used to approach him and shake him with my hands, asking him, Abuelo, ¿qué pasa? Are you okay? There was a lag of a few seconds, as if he was actually making his way back from Vietnam to the Bronx. But as soon as he saw my face, he would smile and hug me. Sí, mi mariposita. That's what he called me. I'm okay. What's wrong? Nothing. I was traveling to visit my friends. But you brought me back safe. When I looked terrified of his screams, he would sing my favorite song. I'm not going to sing it in Spanish because I think some of you know Spanish, so I'm going to cop out. I'm still working on my Spanish. A little butterfly that came down from the sky with its wings spread out and a flower in its beak. For whom are the flowers, if not for me, oh sweetheart? I'm dying for you. When daddy comes, I'm going to tell him that a little butterfly won't let me sleep. I used to ask him, can I travel in my sleep to Abuelo? No, mariposita, butterflies can't travel very far. When you grow up, you'll travel without sleeping. Traveling when you are asleep is very exhausting. Years later, the ghost disappeared. Maybe they returned to Vietnam because they were tired. He became very forgetful. He even forgot that I was his granddaughter. He would call me by my sister's or mother's name. I imagined that those ghosts had eaten big chunks of his memory and taken them back to Vietnam. Mom cried a lot. She couldn't afford to put him in a nursing home, and even if she could, she used to say she would never let him die alone slowly, far away from us. She asked me and my 3 siblings to take turns looking after him when she was at work. You are his guardian angel, she told me. I had to accompany him if he ever went out because he would get lost. She even put a bracelet around his wrist with his name, address, and phone number. This man was not a soldier, but he's running away from another war. I read his file carefully. He worked as a surgeon for 40 years and was the director of a huge hospital in Baghdad and had his own clinic. After the war, they assassinated his brother and threw his corpse on the streets. In the beginning, he was always trying to run away, walking around and trying to open any door he could find. Now he's given up and is withdrawn, hiding in his shell. I was leafing through an issue of Caregiver magazine I saw in the kitchen while I was on a break. There was an ad about a workshop at the Institute of Music and Neurological Function in Bronx. It was about using music to awaken the memories of Alzheimer's and dementia patients. I hadn't heard of the institute. It wasn't that far from where I lived. The workshop was free and participants could get credit towards a certificate or a degree. I thought this would be great for my CV and future prospects if I decided to go back to school. So I registered and was blown away by the notion that music could recover memories. The workshop leader, an expert who had spent 10 years researching the subject, showed a documentary demonstrating the success of using personalized music selections. I was eager to try it out with my patients, especially Sammy, so I emailed his son asking about his favorite music or songs that are intimately linked to specific memories or pleasant periods in his life. He replied with a list of links and names written in Latin letters. I found them and copied them to my iPod. I bought Sammy an extra set of headphones. He didn't resist when I put the headphones on his ears. There was no reaction whatsoever for the first 15 seconds. But then his eyes lit up and he began to sing, and I cried. So a big chunk of the novel is that when he reaches the late stage of dementia, it's only these songs that actually take him back to pleasant times. On the other hand, Omar, our first narrator, when he was taken to have his ear removed, which was the punishment in the 90s for those who desert the army, there was a certain song playing, and so he has the opposite relationship to songs. We still have some time, no? So I'm almost done, but I'm just going to say a few things about Omar and about actually meeting a character. Back in 1996, I met one of the main characters of this novel. I was going with a colleague to find a printer for the nascent graduate student academic journal that we had started at Georgetown University 2 years before, which actually became a peer-reviewed journal. So there is hope for student projects. Or there was hope in the past. This reminds me of one of my favorite quotes from Kafka. There is infinite hope, but not for us. So while discussing the rates and number of coffees in the manager's office, I could see that one of the men working in the press had a missing ear. I knew right away that he must have been one of those who had been punished by the Iraqi regime for deserting the army. I had read a few years before about the decree. The rate of desertion had become so high and the state was severely weakened after the 1990 war, so it resorted to more barbaric measures. His hair was very short and the missing ear was quite conspicuous. At the time, I was consumed with another character, the narrator of my first novel. More than 22 years later, 2016, the earless man haunted me and almost forced his way into my novel. Omar comes from a working class background in Baghdad. He didn't go to college and had to fulfill his mandatory military service. Early on during the 60-day training period, his repulsion by military rituals and the prospects of 2 years of serving in the army becomes intolerable. He decides not to report back to his unit and hides in an orchard belonging to a friend's family. He is caught and arrested after a few months and detained with others. An orolectomy is performed on all of them as decreed by the new law. He is, of course, scarred physically and psychologically. After his release, he works in construction and saves money. I think I said that already. When he comes to Dearborn, Michigan, his caseworker helps him find a job as a night filler in a supermarket and another job as a dishwasher. I mean, one of the many themes of this novel is that, of course, refugee experiences are overdetermined by class and class strategies and all of that. He also another job as a dishwasher at Greenfield Manor, a banquet hall where mostly Christian Iraqi-Americans from upper middle class hold their extravagant weddings and first communion parties, and dance and sing along old nostalgic songs about an Iraq and a Baghdad that Omar never knew, and as far as he is concerned, never existed. He inquires about plastic surgery and realizes that his Medicaid won't cover it, and he would have to save a lot of money in the coming years to be able to afford the surgery. He's quickly disappointed also with Detroit and its stifling atmosphere, hanging out with other Iraqi refugees who come from Rafah. There is another class, in a way, after the 91 Gulf War. Bush, Senior, from Texas.
Connecticut.
But anyway, Maine actually called on Iraqis to take matters into their own hands. I was in Iraq at the time, I heard it on the radio. Called on Iraqis to take matters into their own hands and rise against dictatorship. And when they did, before Twitter, before Facebook, they actually resisted the Iraqi regime and took over 16 of Iraq's 18 provinces. But as usual, the world was silent for a few days, and then Bush and others said, you know, we don't interfere in internal matters, we liberated Kuwait, and it's done. And I have to say this, at the ceasefire negotiations in the Safwan tent, negotiations between General Schwarzkopf and the Iraqi generals, Saddam agreed to everything. He had one request. He wanted the Americans to allow the Iraqi regime to use gunships, helicopters, because they wanted to transfer their wounded. And Schwarzkopf agreed. Later, Saddam actually realized that the United States wanted to defang his army and remove him from regional politics, but they wanted him to stay there because the bombing had decimated soldiers, but kept the Republican Guard. But anyway, so Saddam proceeded to bomb all of these provinces that stood up against him, and tens of thousands of people fled to where the US Army was in Saudi Arabia. And the Saudis, previous and current allies because of shared values. That's a joke. Shared values, Saudi Arabia shared values with Israel. They kept all of these refugees at a refugee camp in the Saudi desert on the border with Iraq. And then, because of the scandalous treatment and violation of human rights, the United States had to intervene and bring them over to the United States. So there's also different memories. So those refugees stood up against the regime. They happen to be mostly Shiites. And Omar, in a way, is alienated by them because they consider his problems are minuscule. He didn't stand up against the regime and so on and so forth. Most of them were housed in Dearborn. So he wants to leave Detroit. Exposure to Iraqis and their world intensifies his nightmares. He is convinced that his sanity and well-being necessitates erasing the past and severing any and all bonds to all things Iraqi and even Arab, because many Arabs in the diaspora are enamored with Saddam Hussein. So he calls Deirdre, the American woman from the Catholic Relief Group who had helped him with his asylum case back in Jordan, and gave him her number. He had kept in touch with her. I want to, this is how he speaks English, I want to very far from Detroit, far from Iraqis and Arabs. I will work anything, any job. She finds him a job with friends of friends who own a goat farm in New Jersey. It's highly unlikely that you would run into any Iraqis or Arabs, but you never know. The closest concentration of Arabs is an hour and a half away by car in Patterson, she tells him. There are a lot of goats, though. Animals are better than humans, he tells her. She tells him also that there is a Syrian surgeon in New Jersey who's willing to perform the surgery for no cost. So that's another incentive to move to New Jersey. Takes a Greyhound bus to New Jersey, and on his last stop during the 10-hour trip to eat at Burger King in Pennsylvania, he notices that the name tag of the man behind the counter reads Omar. So he thinks he is Arab initially, but then hears him speaking Spanish to his coworker. He asks him where he's from, and the man tells him Puerto Rico. So Omar thinks about taking the first step in the process of actively shedding his Iraqiness. He decides that at that moment that he is to be from Puerto Rico. He will no longer have to suffer the idiotic questions many Americans ask right after he tells them he's from Iraq. Do you love Saddam? Why do all Iraqis look like Saddam Hussein? He was ecstatic about his decision, but then thought of potential glitches. He would have to learn Spanish, and the owners of the farm already know his story, but he could tell others in the future that his parents spoke only English at home. Omar at the farm is more at peace with Nubian goats. There is minimum interaction with humans outside the farm, and his boss is kind. He spends his spare time watching TV and learning about American culture to improve his English. He saved most of his money for his plastic surgery and sent some back to his family who are living under the embargo. The phone calls once every 2 months to his mother are the only link he doesn't sever. Despite the peace and quiet and the distance from Iraq and its extensions, Omar still suffers from traumatic nightmares, which often feature variations on one theme, losing another body part. After undergoing plastic surgery, he regains some confidence and is slightly more outgoing. But he keeps his long hair and still feels that people are staring at his scar. He later discovers that they're actually staring at him because of the color of his skin. And that area is mostly a different color skin color. Intimacy, which was difficult before the plastic surgery, is still awkward and uncomfortable. Things start to go well. A visit from 2 FBI agents right after 9/11 to his apartment startles him. His frequent calls to Iraq and the money he transfers were the cause of suspicion, but his boss vouches for his patriotic credentials, as does the big American flag that he hung outside his apartment after 9/11. A few years later, when the so-called liberation of Iraq is afoot, Omar is all for it. He screams when he sees Saddam's statue toppled on his TV screen, but is disheartened later by the violence and chaos the American occupation unleashes and the terrorism that engulfs Iraq. I'm not going to say more because then you will not buy the novel when it comes out. But questions, comments? No questions. Yes.
Just a question for you regarding the places that you pick. I read The Corpse Washer a few years ago. It's really well written, I thought. But I'm curious how you're able to create such vivid worlds like in Baghdad and then one in Brooklyn and New Jersey. It's such different environments. How do you create those environments?
No, that's a great question. I mean, in Baghdad, I lived 23 years there, so that wasn't a problem. The challenge in that novel was that I grew up in a Christian family, and that novel was all about Shiite rituals of corpse washing. So I had to actually do a lot of research. The same here. I mean, I've been in the United States since 1991, and I know Brooklyn very well because I live in New York. But I know also the Iraqi-American Christians are going to hate me after they read this novel because I take take shots at a lot of things. But some of my extended family live in Detroit, so I go there for Christmas, blah, blah, blah. But for New Jersey, I had to do a lot of research, actually, because so I had to go there, just to feel that one's familiar. I also had to do, I mean, like academic research, you do so much research and then you don't use the material, but you just want to feel that if I lose my job, I could work on a goat farm because I had to, because you have to, everything has to make sense. Like, why Nubian? I mean, in the novel, it's Nubian goats because they have the best milk for cheese. And so I actually had to drive, which is not a bad thing, just an hour and a half to go to that area and to make sure the distances and everything. And there is another thing which is important in the novel, which is about lavender, actually. So after he gains the trust of his boss, the boss also, thanks to grants for small businesses during the Bush administration, he actually acquires the lavender farm next door, and then Omar becomes kind of the manager of that farm. But then this whole lavender is going to connect him with Sami, who later we realize, Carmen, the nurse, realizes that the scent of lavender has something to do with something in Sami's memory. But it's a lot of research, for me at least, but for a lot of novelists, you just have to. So actually the people in that area where the goat farms were suspicious because they saw this car just driving around. They thought I was there to steal goats or something. Other questions? Yes.
Yes. First of all, thank you for your reading. And so I heard you talk a lot about damaged bodies and injury, and I kind of immediately thought about Jasper Puar's work. Jasper Puar.
Yes.
So I thought about the right to maim pretty quickly, and like injury and destruction of infrastructure as like a biopolitical mechanism. And I'm wondering, this was kind of the first time I'd heard it in a like diasporic context, and so I'm wondering if that framework was something you were thinking of, or what you think about that in a diaspora.
I mean, to be honest with you, I've seen her talk a couple of times, but I haven't read her work extensively. And
I haven't either.
And for some people, switching between an academic and a creative writer is very easy. For me, it's not. And I'm always like trying not to have any theory or my own politics enter into the novel, because it's always very tempting. I took out a lot of things here because I'm still, after 20 years, I'm angry, very angry. But for example, this Omar character is someone who, and I've met a lot of these people, who has so much anger and hatred of the Saddam regime that he is all for war and all for the bombing and all of that. And I completely disagree with that, but I have to be truthful to the character. So it's difficult sometimes for me. But I also didn't want to, I'm all trying to be on my toes in order not to preach to the reader, because there's a tendency that a lot of very smart writers have, or not so smart writers have, is to preach or bring in the theory into that. So, I mean, I think it comes out naturally because one is always, a lot of things come out unconsciously. But to be honest with you, one of the most defining experiences that I've had is that in 1991, I was in Baghdad, and I hated Saddam Hussein from a very young age. And then the US bombed, as I said, for 2 months, where we didn't have electricity, we didn't have water, we're sitting in a basement listening to the radio, not knowing if we're gonna live or not. And then I came to the US and I watched the footage from CNN, and then I realized that that was the first TV war, and that it's the first war from the perspective of the bombers, and that our experiences as civilians is completely not present at all. And that's the driving force for me for a lot of what I write, which I mean, in an ideal world, I would love to write, you know, very experimental, erotic novels. Not really, but because some people are like, why do you keep writing about this? I'm just like, fucking 1 million people died. And 1.5 million are displaced. And, you know, I have to write about this. But go back to 91 also, the destruction of the actual spaces, the destruction of what Iraq means, whatever it was, the displacement of 5 million people left Iraq. And then the cleansing, the people had to change neighborhoods. The people's lives were destroyed. So that's the kind of thing that if I may say so, I've witnessed myself, and I know it and I feel it. So that sometimes the theory is important because it illuminates and allows me to understand why I'm feeling in a certain way. It's on my reading list for work, which is expanding. Yes, Emily.
Yeah, we would love your erotic novels. Also,
It's forthcoming.
your Mujun, the stuff on the Mujun should come out for the academics. This is also kind of an academic literary questions. I wanted to just ask you about self-translation.
Yes.
Because I know you translate yourself, and that I translate sometimes, but I can't imagine. So, just your reflections on translating yourself. I know this novel's coming out in Arabic first.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. So just talking about that, and then it sounded like so Sammy's section that you read for us was in the first person, and so was Sammy's son. But Omar's section was in the third person, or were you sort of So just talk about first person, third person in this one.
Sure. Now about the translation, it's for me, it's a curse and a blessing. It takes me, you know, this novel took 7 years to finish. I'm not one of those Arab writers who. This is not recorded. Was it recorded? No, I don't.
We'll edit it. Don't say what.
Writing doesn't come easily, so it takes me a long time, and I think about it a long time before I put it on paper. And by the time I put it on paper, it's actually real to me. So when I translated the Corpse Washer myself, I thought first like, oh great, I am the author and the translator. I can change whatever I want. But then I realized that you live with these characters, you hear them speak, and they become real. So I didn't end up changing anything, but I had the advantage of, okay, I can change something if I want to. There are a few parts, there are some references in the Iraqi dialect that would not mean anything in English. So I kept them out. Other than that, it's the same. And the subject matter of the novels, as you can see, is quite heavy. So when I finish, if I translate it, I go back to that atmosphere, and it's not good for me. It's not good for my partner. I'm not a good conversationalist. So with the last novel, someone emailed me and said, I want to translate your novel. And I said, yes, but now I regret it. I should have done it myself. So this one I will do myself. Also because they end up asking so many questions about dialect that I might as well just do it myself. The second question about the voice, yes, I actually changed that. I translated this section 4 years ago, and recently I made it all omniscient narrator, except there are a lot of sections which are people with Lewy body dementia. That's the other thing I have to do a lot of research on. Lewy body dementia. And the music, of course. they have visual hallucinations, and so there are a lot of excerpts where we see how Sami deteriorates because they start, of course, to have paranoia, but they also have visual hallucinations where they see often animals and they mix up things. That was all in the first person, but the rest was the omniscient narrator, just because of a switch from previous novels. So I don't know. It's yeah. Sometimes I shift them to see how it would sound.
Yeah, thank you, Sinan. Lovely to hear from you. I was just, I mean, this Sami's character, of course, forgetfulness, the pathology, right? I mean, and then in Omar, the sort of disfigurement and the reinvention of identity. I mean, all the kinds of things that we go through after trauma and in diaspora or in refugees. But also based in Iraq and with the almost more than 30 years of, and before that, of course, Saddam, before that, 67, before that, 58. I mean, it's a long history, right?
Yeah.
And the Jordanians don't like you. It's like, so, I mean, some of the experiments, and I've just read short stories and translated, some of the experiments, even that Frankenstein book and others, is about going towards the monstrous or the idea of what is sort of cliched as magic realism, but not necessarily. But other ways in which, I mean, I'm talking about form and the kinds of techniques that you and your fellow colleagues who are writing about this period, your generation, if I could say, or even earlier, that how does this kind of, how does one manage to write about quote unquote a realistic novel? Well, it's very difficult because the world is so difficult to grasp. And I was just wondering if you had anything comparatively to say about your own work in comparison to, dead bodies coming alive.
Invitation for me
specters,
for self-praise.
Yeah, specters, ghosts,
No, I'd say it's a very important question. There is a scholar.
Not only the victimhood, it's the issue of, what is the speaking voice? I mean,
it's it's a great question. It's very tricky how to write about massive violence because so there's Hanan Jassim, who is an Iraqi scholar in Spain, is writing about this, and she has coined this term of the banality of violence because, if I may say so that one has to strike a balance because, and sadly, this is a reality that many Arab writers, understandably so, are unconsciously or consciously writing for translation. And there are certain themes and atmospheres and subject matters that publishers in London and New York like. And I can tell you stories about the actual conversations that I've had with them. So there is another danger is that, of course, what happened in Iraq is extensive violence, but how to represent that violence? Is it some kind of cultural violence, and like the Orientalists, so there is a danger into a lot of narratives about Iraq and Iraqi wars being consonant with the American narrative about Iraq being just this place that has this unexplainable violence that has no history. It works very well with this notion that Americans have is like, okay, this is just a violent place of Islam and Sunnis and Shias, we should just leave. So I'm against the grotesque in a way. And also there is another, again, maybe because I'm not that much into science fiction, there is another problematic way of the imbalance of power and all of the problems so-called world literature whereby British or American editors or publishers decide to have an anthology about a certain thing, Iraq 100 years from now, Palestine 100 years from now. And then that invites, of course, the prospect of being published in English and all that. So it ends up engendering and encouraging certain narratives as opposed to others. The other aspect for me is early on, because of my academic study, but also because of the way I approach things, I realized that the problematics of running after and imitating whatever the fad is in the world, to be honest with you. So to be honest with you, when I left Iraq, I had wanted to also write a novel about Iraqi Jews because my aunt's house, their neighbors across the street were Iraqi Jews who were living in Iraq. And yet, and then I learned about the Exodus and all of that, but it became such a fad in recent years to write novels about Arab Jews. Some of them excellent, but a lot of them very problematic. And the same thing is happening now with a lot of Iraqis that are writing about Iraqi Christians, but it's not about Iraqi Christians. It's the metaphor of this loss or something. So the same thing with magic realism. I mean, it's like there's so much magic realism, like, I mean, خلاص. And what I wanted to say is that the Arabic and Persian literary tradition is so rich, and there is so much there. So the previous novel, The Book of Collateral Damage, is all about being in conversation with those forms that I find very, fertile to work with. But the issue of violence is, you asked an important question. How do you represent the violence? You can't run away from it. The same thing with sectarianism, because I wrote this novel about a Christian family, to be honest with you, because I realized no one else was going to write it. And I happen to be from a Christian family.
Sure.
But a lot of Lebanese and Iraqi writers would write novels as if it didn't really matter if you were. Now, I'm not saying that it matters in the way people here understand it, but it's complete bullshit that, people live in this society where it doesn't matter if you're Christian or Muslim or Shia or Sunni. But in real life, they're always trying to place you, kind of like race here in a way. Can't run away from it, but there are more ways of writing about it in a nuanced, complicated way that doesn't reproduce these silly Orientalist narratives. So these novels that are about, which end up being favorably reviewed by the New York Times, that Iraq, and this is the other problem, I have to say this in this country, of course, is the way the Iraq War is represented, and even the term the Iraq War. It's like, who conducted that war? Who invaded the country? It's like taking out the perpetrator, but it works very well because by and large in this country, the soldiers are the victims, and there are no Iraqi civilians. And it's so extensive that a film like Hurt Locker is celebrated as an anti-war film, but if you watch it closely, it's a pro-war film. And Brian Turner, who wins prizes for his poetry collection, if you read his poetry, it's the diction and the language is like the Pentagon. There are insurgents, there are soldiers. It's like, where are the Iraqis? Same thing with the Hurt Locker, the film. There was one Iraqi child you have empathy with, and then he ends up being a terrorist. So novels that represent Iraq as this place where just there is this, and sadly, a lot of Arabs and Iraqis internalize this, as if, that's the other problem, of course, the hierarchy of violence. Violence committed by others is reprehensible and morally unacceptable, but the violence that we commit or violence from a drone is just somehow sublime. The last thing I say, years ago at NYU, I was like, there was a panel about trauma and drones. It's like, okay, let me go and hear what drones are doing to Afghanis and Iraqis. Guess what it turned out to be? It was about the trauma of the drone operators.
No.
Because, and this is where the shared values with Israelis, I have to say, is if you like, a lot of Israeli culture is that it's a catastrophe that we are forced to do this. So who was it? Golda Meir, who said, I will never forgive the Arabs for forcing us to kill them or something like that.
No, thank you.
Sorry, the demagogue and the preacher is coming out.
That was the cue.
Okay, we're nearly done, but I'm going to abuse my position and ask one last question. Okay, the Vietnam vet grandfather, different earlier imperial war, very sympathetic and sort of linked to Sammy the surgeon. What's at stake in making that connection in the novel?
You know what? Sometimes I realize, when I went to Baghdad in 2003, July, to make a documentary with a group of colleagues about how Iraqis feel about the occupation, we met a US soldier who wasn't Puerto Rican, but he wasn't white. And he said, I have more, he told us, every day I think I have more in common with the Iraqis than with my fellow white soldiers. But that stayed with me. Later, we're going to find the link structurally. But it's because it's in the novel, whereby the irony for Omar is that later he begins to learn more about Puerto Rico. Because while the US was supposedly conducting elections in Iraq, the Supreme Court refused to allow Puerto Ricans to participate in votes. So I ended up saying even the country that I chose turned out to be, but it's just identifying in terms of culture and skin color, because Omar, he thinks, you know, he's after his plastic surgery, he's going to be great. But in New Jersey, he's considered a Puerto Rican. And then at the gym, where he also, and I didn't read, but kind of in regaining his confidence, he starts to do bodybuilding. But at the gym, he encounters these buffs who have also a Confederate flag. So I don't know. The Puerto Rican thing just made sense in the larger picture. Maybe, perhaps, I had a colleague at Gallatin who was Puerto Rican, and I know now I'm self-analyzing. But when I arrived at NYU, I'll be honest here, as if I wasn't honest in the previous 60 minutes. When I arrived at NYU Gallatin as a young faculty, the only people who were kind to me were an African-American and a Puerto Rican. Maybe that is, and I hung out with Renee, the Puerto Rican, and got to know a lot about Puerto Rico and stuff like that. And there are a disproportionate number, of course, in the nursing field of minorities, right? And then she in a way vicariously is treating her grandfather when she didn't know about the music, because there is a part where she said, I wish I knew this and I could have had him listen to, because it would have been given him some dignity in his last few days. Or Wallahu A'lam, God knows best, which is a very postmodernist thing to say because it keeps the question open. Since we are in Ramadan, I'm saying Wallahu A'lam. Thank you so much. Thank you for your attention. By the way, even if it were recorded, I would have said those things. I've said them before and made a lot of enemies.